My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kali Mahorra on Almayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kali Mahorra, and my audience does too. Kali Mahorra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kali Mahorra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but discussing faraway Brazil. How big is Brazil? We'll see, and how big a result the recent presidential election was. In 1985, I lent to a Brazilian trade union leader 200 crisp American dollars. I can still remember the feel of them in my hand. Recently, that trade union leader repaid me in full with a smashing victory, coming back from the prison cell to the presidential house. Yes, that's right, Lula da Silva, the leader of the Workers' Party of Brazil, has fully repaid his debt to the people of Brazil because they stuck by him when the junta of Bolsonaro put him behind bars unjustly and with the tacit support of the United States of America. Lula's smashing victory over Bolsonaro upset many an apple cart. In fact, so reprehensible was the Bolsonaro government that many people who would not normally be lining up behind a workers' party were keen for him to be defeated, which may have sown a seed or two of doubt in some people's minds about what kind of president Lula will be in this, his new presidential term. But rejoice, rejoice, I say, because although Bolsonaro was frequently compared to Donald Trump, he was in truth far, far worse than that. He was virtually a fascist, and if he had the chance, he would have put the jackboots on. So the defeat of Bolsonaro is a victory for the left and for progressive people everywhere in the world. But the importance for Latin America can scarcely be underestimated. There's been a pink tide, of course, and we have charted it on Almayadeen television, on Kali Mahorra, over these last few years. But this is something of a different order. Brazil is a behemoth, a truly gigantic country, which dwarfs all others in Latin America and most others in the world. Its population, its base of riches, real riches, natural resources, mineral resources, and of course its wonderful, wonderful and plentiful people. It is going to cause shockwaves across the Latin American political landscape. Joe Biden was quick to congratulate Lula on his presidential victory, which may have been as much about his loathing of Bolsonaro as it was of his love for Lula. We'll see if it lasts. But I mentioned those seeds of doubt earlier. And here's what I mean. When George Soros is rooting for you and actually working for you in a presidential election, people who've seen what George Soros has done across the world will naturally raise an eyebrow. So what kind of Lula will be in charge come January of Brazil? Will Bolsonaro accept his defeat? He has de facto agreed to transition, but he has yet to verbalize any acceptance of his defeat. Will the armed forces of Brazil accept the Workers' Party's return to power? Perhaps more pointedly, will the police force in Brazil accept that? A militarized police force with a great many sympathizers of Bolsonaro within their ranks. Will the lawfare that was mounted against Lula and Dilma, his successor, be practiced again? Are we likely to see further moves on the legal front to somehow put Lula behind the 8 ball? But for me, Lula, keep the $200. You more than repaid it with your wonderful victory. Our first guest, because of course, as always, I'm joined by distinguished experts, I'm merely the enthusiastic amateur here, is Julia Felmanas, who is the coordinator in the United Kingdom of Lula's Workers' Party of Brazil. She's also a writer, translator, and interpreter. Julia, a big congratulations from all fellow thinkers and feelers across the world. How did it feel to see your leader come back from behind bars only a year and a half ago, 2 years maybe, and 3 years behind bars, and now on the steps of the presidential house?
Thank you very much. Of course, we're absolutely delighted to have Lula win the elections. We knew it was going to be quite difficult with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro threw his whole weight behind trying to win these elections. He had the governmental machine behind him. He spent billions and billions of reais trying to prop up Lula's most famous benefit, the Bolsa Familia, which he then changed name. But during the pandemic, when people were really, really suffering, there was a whole period when people weren't receiving anything. And yet, 2 months before the election, he suddenly propped up, increased the amounts, and gave out a large amount of Bolsa Familia to the population. As well as that, we had the propaganda machine of the evangelical churches, who were basically declaring that Lula was the Antichrist. We had a lot of rural agricultural people, businessmen, who were threatening their staff with the sack if they voted for Lula. And on the actual day of the election, we had the highway federal police stopping people to prevent them from reaching the ballot box. So it was a very difficult election. A lot of fake news as well. I forgot to mention that. There was a lot of fake news as well.
It was, for me, you may know better, it was a surprisingly close result. Bolsonaro got more votes than I imagined that he would. Is that how you saw it?
That's exactly why, in a way, Lula was expected to win in the first round. It was 50-50. I think the polls were pretty much right in what they had to say. But Bolsonaro's machine basically made that move to force people. They started giving people money. There were mayors in town, in certain towns, we found out from the Brazilian mainstream global TV, where they went out and did the report, where you had mayors who gathered up the people who were receiving these benefits, registering their name and giving them some extra money to make sure that they wouldn't vote for Lula. People actually preventing people from going from their places to somewhere else. So I think although the results are actually very close, we're talking about 59.9 for Lula and 49.1 for Bolsonaro, he has a lot more goodwill in society. I think the actual population of Brazil, there is a majority of the population of Brazil that is bigger than the actual electoral count that will be on Lula's side.
Calvin Tucker, you're an expert on elections, recently again an observer at the Venezuelan elections, campaign manager for the Morning Star newspaper. Were you anxious in the run-up to polling day? Did you hear and fear, as I did, that something would go wrong, that some kind of coup might be mounted? Or did you think it would go as it did?
I think it's always an anxious time in any election in Latin America because of the history of US interference in elections dating back to the Monroe Doctrine. We've seen this pattern not just in Brazil with the jailing of Lula, the removal using lawfare of Dilma Rousseff, but we've seen this in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Chile, of course, in 1973. So there's nothing new about attempts to overthrow democracy in Latin America. And of course, we've been here before. This is the second pink tide, or I prefer to call it the red wave. At least part of that pink tide is
Let's
pretty
wait and
red.
see about that.
It's pretty red. Part of it's pretty red in Venezuela and Cuba, for example. And the first red wave, of course, came about because of the failure of neoliberalism from around 1980 to the turn of the century. Neoliberalism, which was ushered in by the Chilean coup in 1973. A failed economic model which gave way to the first pink tide or the red wave. But the US empire fought back in a pretty spectacular form, using many of its old tricks from the CIA handbook, but also this new concept of lawfare, which our guest from the Workers' Party has touched on, and also in Venezuela, the extraordinary spectacle of the United States literally choosing a president who never stood in an election, Juan Guaido, who stands up in a city square in Caracas and declares himself the president of the country and then goes on to be recognised by Canada, Australia, the EU, and the 24 richest countries in the world. So in answer to your question, George, I'm always worried about elections in Latin America. At the same time, I was confident that Lula had maintained support from his first period in office and had generated new support on the backs of the terrible failings of the Bolsonaro regime.
Victor Fraga, filmmaker extraordinaire, Brazilian activist in London. In this case, the United States was on Lula's side. What does that mean?
Well, there's a dichotomy between Republicans and Democrats in the US, and that's very relevant for internal politics. But when you look at foreign policy, this is far less relevant. You got to bear in mind there was no coup d'etat in Latin America under George Bush, and that Lula would attend George Bush's ranch in Texas and have a barbecue. So they got on really, really well. Well, Lula's a statesman. He gets on with everyone. That's what he's known for. Under the radar of Obama, we had 3 coups d'etats. We had Honduras, we had Paraguay, and we had Brazil. Incidentally, the same American ambassador, a woman by the name of Liliana Ayalda, was the ambassador in Paraguay when the coup happened, in Brazil when the coup happened, and in Honduras when the coup happened. So what I'm trying to say is that when Biden opted to phone Lula within 40 minutes of his victory, he wasn't thinking so much in terms of international policy. He was thinking of Trump. Bolsonaro is a mini Trump, a far more radical Trump, as you pointed out. He's far more dangerous than Trump. He openly and unequivocally celebrates torture, dictatorship, something Trump doesn't do. So what Biden was doing was ensuring that a tropical version of Trump did not succeed. If a tropical version of Trump, such as Bolsonaro, succeeds, he'd be he'd be fueling Trump in the US. So I think when he phoned Lula, he was simply thinking internal affairs. He wasn't thinking foreign affairs. In the US, both Democrats and Republicans have been equally destructive to Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine is 200 years just next year. It's subversion of it's a subversion of the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine was created in order to prevent the Europeans from interfering in Latin America, but the Americans modified it and interpreted it as treating Latin America as their backyard. And I don't think that's going to change. So Biden is not our friend, but Lula is certainly going to have a good relationship with Biden, as he did with George Bush.
Let's cross to Latin America, to Chile, in fact, part of the pink tide that Calvin Tucker was talking about. Hector Rios is a Chilean social scientist and from the Institute of Social Research at the University College of London. Hector, welcome to the show. Hector, after now a swathe of left-wing victories from Mexico down to Brazil and Chile, are the region's politics about to fundamentally change in years to come?
Yes, I think we are seeing Latin America how it's usually described like a second wave of pink-tide governments, or as I prefer, as a second wave of progressive governments. And there is a couple of key points to understand. So the first one is this wave came from the defeat and crisis of the right-wing governments. So unlike the first wave, when you saw a massive wave of protest, demonstration, and uprising in different countries, that was the beginning of the driving force of the first wave of progressive government. In the second is more about economic and political crisis, and there is not the same level of strength and cohesion in social forces behind government. So one of the cards that these progressive governments are playing is the card of economic and political stability, more than change. So that means that the progressive agendas are still on the table, and this government going to push for changes in Latin America as a region and also as in their different countries, but they are not as radical as they were in the first wave of the progressive government. So we're expecting a little bit more conservative stand because they have a weaker position within national politics, and they have a more complex relationship with social movements.
Given the narrowness of the majority and the constant doubt being thrown on the result by Bolsonaro's supporters, will this result hold, do you think?
I think we can expect some political unrest from social movements that might find that the agenda of government is not good enough. But also we may find a huge pressure of reactionary forces behind Bolsonaro movements against the government. It's something that we already saw after the elections. Although Bolsonaro recognized the victory of Lula in Brazil, you saw different kind of grassroots movements related to Bolsonaro confronting and denying the result of the election. That is a similar kind of pattern that we saw, for example, in the case of Trump in the US. And it seems like it is a common strategy of far right-wing populist forces around the world of denying the democratic election, that put pressure on elected governments and try to block within institution, but also outside institution, any effort of transformation and agenda. So I think there will be a lot of opposition on the street, on parliament, to the agenda imposed by Bolsonaro. I think Lula is a really well-experienced politician. He's aware of this. So he was, since the beginning, trying to build a broader coalition to beat Bolsonaro in the election. hopefully that coalition will remain relatively stable over time and will manage the capacity to control this uprising. Also, we need to be aware of different kind of lawfare against the government of Lula, as happened, for example, with the case of Dilma Rousseff at the beginning of 2010, when the attack came from the street, but also came from organized legal attacks on the legitimacy of government. Lula was victim of those attacks, of course, during 2010. He was in prison, so he's perfectly aware of all these tactical strategies. Probably the new one is the important role of grassroots movements around the far right-wing parties from the side of Bolsonaro. That is something to see how the government, how the left will cope with these movements. That was a card of changing the game in the case of the US. So we need to see how that forces are occupied in the case of Brazil.
As a Latin American citizen, as you are, how do you see this comeback by Lula in Brazil's relations with the rest of Latin America and perhaps particularly Venezuela and Cuba?
Lula, well, first, Brazil play the major role in Latin American politics, so is the major global player. So the position that Brazil takes in the international context will, of course, be a point of reference for the rest of the government. Lula itself is an important and historical leader of the left in the region and worldwide, so also we probably concede a lot of attention. There will be no questions about a strong connection between Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Brazil, and of course, between Bolivia and Brazil, mainly because they share similar agendas and because they have been long-time allies during the first wave of progressive government. So that is expected to happen. However, I think there is important dilemmas, particularly with the new left from Chile. There is no consensus about the position that the region should have relating to Venezuela and Cuba. I think the position of Lula as the position of Bolivia, Colombia, and Mexico is quite clear. They support the governments. They are against any kind of foreign intervention. And they are not being extremely critical with what happened in an internal level in both countries. But that is a clear contrast with the position, for example, that Gabriel Boric is taking towards Venezuela and Cuba. In the case of Chile, the president, Gabriel Boric, has a stronger criticism against the human rights violation in Venezuela and Cuba. And that is something, of course, to consider how both positions would negotiate with each other in order to create a cohesive bloc of regional politics.
Much more coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming from London, talking about Brazil. Julia, you're the UK coordinator of Lula's party. You know his thought, you know his development. How has he, if at all, changed? How did prison time change him? How did the current political developments change him? How did the narrowness of the election victory change him? In other words, what kind of Lula can we look forward to in January?
We have perhaps two sides to the same story. Basically, Lula is a much more mature and experienced person. He went through prison. He saw a lot of people that he negotiated with and tried to make a government with turn their backs on him and on his the Workers' Party, and Dilma Rousseff, our president, put him in prison, and he was for a short time a pariah within Brazil and Brazilian politics. So Lula is very, very much aware of the people that he is dealing with. He's also said a number of times, and I truly believe him, that if he's come back into Brazilian politics, he hasn't come back just to do what he did before. He's come back to do more, okay? So he is much more aware. He wants to do the social policies that he brought along during his first governments. And he's also a far more, let's say, open. He spent 580 days in prison, mainly reading. And he did a lot of reading and a lot of learning. So, for example, for him now, the environment is something very important. He's very, very much aware of, not that he wasn't before, but he's more sure about the ethnic lines of the Brazilian population, i.e. about the needs and necessities of Black people and of Black people representing themselves as well. So he's going to be a Lula that's far more radical in certain ways. However, as we have seen, he is also a Lula that is coming into a Brazil that has been almost decimated by Bolsonaro. And he's also having to ally himself with all these people that put him in prison, basically. So that will mean that he will have to be a lot less radical in the types of policies that he is going to put forward because of the alliances he's going to have to make. So we will have to see how far Lula will be able to be himself and achieve the things that he wants to do, which is a far more radical Brazil, or whether he's going to be prevented because of the broad alliance that he had to make. One of the things I would like to say, however, is that the environmental agenda is very important. And that is probably something that his allies will also be on his side. So I think that and foreign policy is another thing. And foreign policy will be very much based on the environment as well. Foreign policy will be something that will be almost like a protection for him to be able to be slightly more radical within the country.
Let's go to Oslo. Adam Souza is president of the social organization SEJA, which provides financial support and professional development in places like Rio de Janeiro. Adams, welcome to the show.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Adams, now that Brazil is added to the long list now of left-wing victories in recent elections, should we expect a big change now in Latin America?
Well, we have to think that the world has changed dramatically since Lula last administration, and that the Brazil global and regional standing has diminished under Bolsonaro administration. Lula new administration should definitely emphasize a more South-South cooperation and the regional diplomacy. This is important for Lula and for Brazil to regain and rebuild international credibility that Brazil has lost. And at the moment, I see that Brazil is definitely regain the South-South cooperation, and we emphasize the diplomacy in the South, but at the same time, we'll focus in a very pragmatic way with the North.
Tell us, Adams, who are the main supporters of Lula? What's the demography of his base in terms of age and ethnicity and so on?
Well, I see that Lula has doing a movement to gain the support of the new generation, especially the Black and the poor people that, for decades have been supporting him, especially the poorest. But Lula has been working and doing a movement with the young generation, especially in the peripheries of Brazil. For example, during Lula's campaign, he visited one of the biggest favela complexes in Rio de Janeiro, called Complexo do Alemão. So Lula is definitely trying to dialogue with the new generation. He's trying to make I think the new government, the new administration will try to have a better dialogue with the minority groups. I think that's something that in the past administration, the left PT, the left government, in a way forgot to dialogue with the based movement, right? The minorities groups that are in the base that give support for Lula and for the left in Brazil. So I see definitely like new faces coming into Lula administration. For instance, Lula, the transition government, so they invited Aniele Franco, which is the sister of Marielle Franco, who was assassinated in the past years. So I see that Lula is definitely trying to create a dialogue with the youth from the peripheries.
Your organization fights battles, poverty and underdevelopment, not just in Brazil, but elsewhere. How much do you think Lula's presidency can do to tackle issues like poverty and underachievement, lack of opportunity, particularly of young people?
I think and I see Lula increasing the effort and resources and budget on social programs that was reduced under Bolsonaro administration. Poverty has increased in Brazil in the past years, and this has happened for several crises domestically, but also in the world, internationally. And the COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to poverty increase and food insecurity increase in Brazil. At this time, about 41% of Brazilians are experiencing and facing food insecurity. And I see Lula and new administration working with the youth and getting the poorest back as a priority into his agenda.
Look, Brazil is a big and important country. It can't cut itself off from the rest of the world, a world that is riven with conflict, not just the obvious NATO-Russia confrontation over the body of Ukraine, but in the Middle East and many other places. How much of a distraction will that be for Lula? Will he be able to focus on the domestic, or will he be pulled into international affairs?
Yeah, Lula, new administration starting January next year, have many challenges ahead. The world that is coming, it's a very different world from Lula past administration. We have regional problems in Latin America and South America, and we have problems in Europe. We have the war in Ukraine, and Lula will need to balance. We need to balance and regain credibility in the region, but also try to build Brazil credibility abroad. So this is not an easy task. Lula would definitely need to focus domestically because there is a movement that really is growing. There is the support of Bolsonaro, we call Bolsonarists, that since Lula was elected, they are doing strikes in Brazil, they are doing anti-democratic demonstrations. So there is a very domestic pressure under his new administration, and he needs to balance and make it everything domestically very stable, while at the same time he needs to get Brazil back into the international agenda. He needs to get Brazil back in the conversation and the forums of climate cooperation, human rights. He needed to get other credibility in the UN. So it's not an easy task. So Lula definitely has like many challenges ahead.
Calvin, when I knew Lula a long time ago, his worldview was very much like yours or mine. How much has time and the new conditions altered what he's likely to do on the international level, including regionally? I mean, for example, what will his attitude be to Cuba and Venezuela? Will it be like Chile's, or will it be as it was before? What will his attitude be in the BRICS towards Russia, towards China, and so on?
That's a good question, George. Look, he has to re-establish himself as a president and as a politician, and re-embed the left in all the institutions of the Brazilian state. That's not going to be a straightforward or a simple task to do. And he came back into power on the basis of a set of alliances, some of which are with his political opponents or former opponents, and some of those individuals and institutions are pretty unsavoury. So, like all presidents, he begins with the cards he's got in his hands, not the cards he might prefer to have. I think in terms of his domestic power, it will depend to a large extent on the mass movement that backs him. And of course, that's much broader than the Workers' Party. It includes the trade union movement, other left political parties, indigenous and social movements, as your other guests have alluded to. Where will Lula stand on foreign policy issues? Well, I think the signs are positive. I mean, he's already been attacked by Zelensky for offering some criticism of the NATO proxy war in the Ukraine. And Lula, of course, has a strong track record of backing Cuba's right to self-determination and independence alongside Venezuela and Nicaragua. I don't expect to see a sort of Lula the firebrand suddenly emerge on the world stage like a sort of reincarnation of Hugo Chavez or anything like that. But his behind-the-scenes diplomacy, I would expect, on foreign affairs to be definitely on the progressive, the redder side of the pink tide.
Redder side of pink. What do you think, Victor? Firebrand or damp squib?
Well, neither. Lula, he's boasting. He's just been boasting in the past few days that he's been invited to meet many world leaders in Egypt for COP27. He boasts that both Zelensky and Putin approached him. And so many other leaders, Biden and others, have requested to meet him. So Brazil did have a very solid relationship with Cuba. Brazil had a program called Mais Médicos, which enabled 40,000 Cuban doctors to work in Brazil. But Lula has had, Lula's a statesman. Lula is incredibly magnanimous, and he has learned how to walk among the serpents. So he has a good relationship with both the US and virtually all American nations or all Latin American nations. I don't see that changing. I do agree with Julia when she says that the environment is going to become far more prominent than in the past. The Workers' Party was widely criticized in the past for not paying enough attention to the environmental agenda. A woman called Marina da Silva, who was Lula's minister, she stepped out. Now she's probably going to become once again the environmental minister. She's a woman. She is an indigenous woman, an incredibly intelligent woman. And the fact that she might return to the environmental minister is a huge sign. It's a sign that she believes Lula is prepared to go further than what he has done in the past. Otherwise, she wouldn't even consider. There hasn't been a formal invitation, but she is the most likely person to become our environmental minister again. In the past, she stepped down because she thought Lula wasn't doing enough. So again, I think that's very solid evidence that Lula is going to do a lot more for the environment, and that's going to win him a lot of friends in across the world. I mean, including the U.S., because Biden is, of course, far more moderate than Trump, and he's not a denialist. He's not an obscurantist. He is embracing the green agenda, isn't he? So. Yeah,
especially in Ukraine, where he's setting the world on fire and threatening nuclear war. Julia, to what extent are these things a cipher for a turn away from the original purpose of the Workers' Party, which, as the name suggests, is a party for the working class, talking about the environment, talking about minorities, identity politics? To what extent are these, as it were, alternatives to working class politics, socialist working class politics?
Okay, before we get into that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the geopolitics in Latin America a little bit. I just wanted to add that Brazil, the thing about Venezuela and Cuba, regardless whether they are left-wing or right-wing or whatever they may be, Brazil, as part of our constitution, we have a policy of self-determination and sovereignty. So it has been Brazil's foreign policy, regardless even of Lula, to not interfere in other people's affairs. So that's for a start. Lula is also very keen on developing and strengthening the institutions of Latin America, like, for example, the Mercosur, the UNASUR, and CELAC. And we expect him to be doing that. And the strengthening of South-South relations, in particular, relations within Latin America are very important for him and his foreign policy. So I believe he's going to be somebody much like in the past, where he's trying to work diplomatically to try and dissolve any possible conflicts that there may be, in this case with the USA, Venezuela, USA, Cuba. And also I think he's going to be a force for peace in the world. He's going to advocate diplomacy as opposed to war, even in the case of the Ukraine. In relation to workers' policy, again, Lula has been very clear that we need to rediscuss the place of workers within our society, especially talking about workers in the new professions of the platform, etc. He's very much aware that there's a whole swathe of working people who have absolutely no rights, who live informally, and that is not just a problem for Brazil, but a problem for the world. So I see whether he will be successful in that, I don't know, but I think he will at least start a debate about the place of the worker in the new society we live in terms of having stronger rights for workers within this new world formation that we have.
This is when the problem of these dubious allies comes in, though, isn't it? The more clear Lula is, the old Lula, the more problem he'll have with the unsavory allies. The more he tries to please the unsavory allies, the risk of disillusioning those who are hoping for the old Lula grows. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it is correct. But we just had a little taste of it right now, to be honest, because Lula just made a speech, I think a couple of days ago, where he mentioned, like he mentioned in a lot of his speeches all the time, about how terrible is the poverty in Brazil, and he actually cried about the number of people who were living underneath the poverty line and actually being hungry. And suddenly that sparked off a fear of the so-called market, and the market didn't like his speech, and could Lula make sure that he wasn't going to do that, and how they'd been tricked by Lula, that they didn't expect Lula to behave like this. In fact, Lula did nothing at all, because he's been saying all the time that he was going to address poverty, whatever. He was going to be fiscally responsible, but address poverty, much like he did in his other government. But I think Lula is far more, that's where I think Lula his experience in prison has given him far more courage to be open about his plans. He's not going to stand back, oh my God, the markets are really worried about me, or what am I going to do now? He's far more likely to say, no, I'm sorry, this is what I've been elected for. I was voted in by the people, and this is what I'm going to do. Not saying that there are not going to be any problems, not saying he'll be able to do absolutely everything, or even that he won't be able to disillusion some people. He will.
Will Bolsonaro go quietly, do you think?
No, I think his supporters, the armed forces are also sort of not giving clear signals as well.
Victor,
So,
what do you think?
Well, I think the armed forces are playing a very regrettable role. While they are saying there has been no frauds, they are also saying, hypothetically, there could have been fraud. So that's dog whistle politics to his most ardent supporters. And you do have right now 250 trucks and about 2,000 people outside the Brazilian military in Brasilia demanding a military coup, openly doing that. Confronting the Brazilian society. And that's a crime according to Brazilian constitution. And so he's still trying. He's not going to succeed. These people are going to get tired by the 1st of January. They don't have enough support. But the military have been purposely ambiguous. So they are saying that we have to respect the results. However, something may have gone wrong.
Coup or no coup, Julia?
I don't think he's got enough strength for a coup, but it's going to, they haven't gone there, basically. Yeah. But
they haven't gone away, They never do. The enemy never sleeps. As far as I'm concerned, it's the best $200 I ever spent. Go Lula, El Presidente. Thanks for watching. Kalimahora with me, George Galloway.